Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Ted. This is the Business of Cyber Show. Thanks for joining today. If this is the first time you're joining, recognize that we talk about resources on this show. We talk about CISOs, OT directors, IT directors, folks in the security realm that don't have enough time, people, or budget to execute on the roadmap that they think is necessary. And this podcast is dedicated to helping them understand what kind of resources are out there. I'm going to be joined by partner in crime, partner in life, partner in business, Cherise Esparza. Thanks for joining. How are you today?
Good. Thank you, everybody, for having me on the show today.
Yeah. So, just a little bit of a background. How did we get here to this moment? You wanted to come on the show. You wanted to talk about this. It happened 15 days ago. We've titled the show "The Global Impact of the CrowdStrike Incident." Tell me a little bit about why you wanted to come on the show and kind of what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, I usually, having a 20 plus year in critical infrastructure cybersecurity, it takes a lot for me to get really excited and animated about things. But just like you all were witnessing this outage in real time, it really invoked a lot of emotions for me. And I really felt passionate about how this outage was being communicated, the perception for which it was being played out in the media, the responses that were given, and really just during the actual outage incident, how frantic and paralyzed organizations felt during that time, not to mention the impact on the daily lives of regular human beings and Joes across the world. And then I felt a lot of empathy for the teams that were tasked at hand to respond, and then figure out the best way to get their organizations back and running. So
You've been in those situations, haven't you?
I've been in those shoes, coming from a background in my early career as a systems administrator and actually dealing with kernel outages and issues and drivers. It really invoked, like I said, an area in me that I felt really passionate about to speak up on. Not to say that there are other events in the world going on that I don't have opinions on, but this one I felt really passionate about.
Yeah, it makes sense. Makes sense. Well, good deal. Well, I think a lot of people, how many days ago was the event? About 2 weeks, maybe? 15
It
days, maybe?
happened on July 19th. And for anybody that's been living under a rock, I'm sure has heard of the outage incident that happened with CrowdStrike.
Right. Yeah. So we're going to talk a little bit about you. I think, laying a foundation of where you come from, I think is going to give the audience a good understanding of who you are and why you think the way you think. We'll talk a little bit about the incident itself. We want to go step by step. I'd love for you to outline what really happened on what days. And then let's talk about the impact of the industry. Let's talk about the different responses that the key stakeholders did. And then I want to spend a lot of time on lessons learned for the critical sector, right? We can deviate from this a little bit, but this is where I'd like to spend our time because it's a lot of information to cover, but I'm excited to do so with you. If you're joining us live, know that any comments that you put up on the screen, we can share that so that everybody else can see. If you have any questions or some comments that you want Cherise to talk about, don't hesitate to tell us what those are. It's a pleasure to have you on the show. But without further ado, Cherise, you're on deck here. Tell us a little bit about what you do and where you're from. I know these items, but many folks don't. So tell us a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to believe I've spent 20 plus years in our industry. My career really started from when I was a teenager as a developer during my teenage years. So I'm very familiar with different coding languages that then spawned a career for me in my collegiate journey to focus in computer science and engineering, where I fell in love with cybersecurity. And it was through those experiences and job opportunities that I was able to have various roles, starting out as a pen tester. So really understanding the inside guts of operating systems, applications, the full stack, and the vulnerabilities that lay at those each layers, and how to inform and communicate organizations of those risks, those vulnerabilities, those exploits. And then from there, my career just really parlayed into an overall understanding of network infrastructure and architecture, the communication avenues, the multitude of various ways, whether that's satellite, microwave, regular TCP, through different network architectures and organizations. But I really found my way and my journey into critical infrastructure after spending over a decade securing critical infrastructure for some of the largest organizations, pipeline, midstream, downstream, offshore. I've seen it all. And I've also been in different roles as an operator, as an engineer, as a leader, communicating what some of these risks mean, how to protect them, the technical complexities, but more important, the impediments of business operations and still trying to turn a profit, and what it means when there are outages, whether they're planned or unplanned, running those teams, having to communicate externally. So my vast experience now has afforded and allowed me to build a company alongside you in SecurityGate and have a different perspective of serving the community with solutions that bring value, ROI, and most importantly, protect their environments and keep them up and going for their delivery of their goods and services.
Right.
So,
well, and when you see an attack like this, I just use the word attack. I'm not sure that's the right choice of word, but it just came to mind. When you see this incident, I'm not even sure that's the right word, because some people are going to say it's not an incident. When you say an event, right? So let's just say when you have an experience like this, no matter what size company you are.
There was a denial of service, whether it was intended or unintended.
Right.
That's what happened.
What I'm getting at is, as you talk about how impactful this is, maybe how it was preventable, how we can prevent it in the future, I just want to lay the foundation. Your background started in IT, and then you went to critical infrastructure companies. You started to take over more of the OT responsibilities as well as IT. And I always think if you're going to get an OT critical infrastructure cyber, there's two ways you can get to it. There's no lateral entry. You can't just walk in to a major oil and gas operator or a major transportation company and say, hi, I'd like to be an OT. Usually it gets fed from two places. You see automation, engineering, instrumentation folks, operational folks, or you see somebody coming from the IT cyber side, and they cross-train and they cross-learn one of these two avenues. Do you agree with that methodology of where most of the foundational kind of feeders come from? And number two, confirm you came in from the IT side, right?
That is correct. Yes. My particular path and the extensive knowledge that I had around network communications and cybersecurity enabled me to make recommendations and ultimately lead our cyber division and apply cyber practices into our OT SCADA environments that never had any kind of cybersecurity, whether that was firewall, network intrusion detection, or IPS systems.
Yeah, and I think it's important just to understand, because a lot of people will say, and there's a lot of people online saying this wasn't, let's say, an incident or an attack on the OT side, but everything got shut down with the same end result, even though this was an IT issue, right? Let's dive into it a little bit more. Diving into this particular slide that you put together, we've got an incident overview. Looks like the outage happened on 19 July, 4 in the morning. They distributed a faulty configuration update for its Falcon server software program running on Windows PCs and servers. Walk us through this incident from the ground up, Cherise.
So I first want to demystify some, fake news out there where a lot of people want to jump to conclusions around how did this happen in the first place? Someone pushed a button and it pushed it out everywhere, or there was no, secure development life cycle of testing. Well, it's actually coming out that the files that are in question that were malformed, that got pushed, actually were in a bundle of files that were getting tested at different times before it actually got pushed in July 19th. So what we're really talking about here, Ted, from a technical perspective, is the CrowdStrike Sensor Falcon, which is deployed locally on endpoints, antivirus. We all know what that means, right? And that is typically deployed, yes, on IT infrastructure, Windows, and servers. But as we all know, in OT, there are HMI systems, there are engineering workstations that sit in the corporate level, right, that receive email, that maybe receive information from some of the applications that allows them visualizations to make some decisions at facility sites, at off-rig platforms, on terminals for transportation, etc. So how it impacted OT, that's how it impacted. And we can dive a little bit more into that. So what happened was, in order for protection of this type of nature, this type of security solution, antivirus, it lives in a ultra elevated privilege manner on an endpoint. So what does that mean? It means that it lives underneath the operating system at the kernel level. If you're thinking at run 0 level, this is where we are. So basically what lives there are different configuration files and drivers typically. And under normal operations, whenever files are pushed for updates, it goes through checks of security, certifications, and signatures. But for this particular type of security software to do its job in real time to prevent abnormal behavior, traffic patterns in real time, solutions like CrowdStrike and others deploy their solution in an elevated manner that circumvents signature authorities for malformed checks, etc. So what does that mean? The way CrowdStrike is basically configured for these files was through their rapid response capability that allows them to push up updates in a manner that will respond to any real-time threat. Right? In the end of the day, people are buying these solutions because they want to plug it in and not think about it. They want to just know and tell their boss they made their investments and they're going to be protected. And so whether or not some view this as an opportunity to perform some better due diligence in the supply chain manner of their vendors, or understanding which software has elevated privileges, for all intents and purposes, as the information has come out, tests were made on the files that were pushed, but they were still not validated based on the way those checks were happening and the tests were happening. So we can get into a debate on whether or not this could have been prevented with better oversight. We can have that conversation later. But at the end of the day, it still deployed a malformed file that ultimately crashed the operating system. And also to that point, Ted and audience listening, it's designed that way to crash the operating system so that in the event of a malintended operation happening, it shuts it down. Now, the impacts have been cascading since then, and through the media we've learned, and we'll get into the impact of what has happened, but the software is intended to have the highest level of privilege. Most all antivirus, when you are buying the latest and greatest AI generated, fast acting response, plug it in and forget about it, there are risks that consumers are taking that are beyond their technological level of understanding the impacts or knowing the questions to ask. And so are we blindly just installing a lot of software? I would say so, unless you're technically competent to ask these questions on what are the impacts and what are the dependencies should something go wrong when I'm giving a software of privileged access, this access on hundreds, thousands, millions of computers. And we'll get into that in a minute.
So everybody, and we'll get to the blame game in a second, but I want to go back a little bit. Take everything that you just said from a technical perspective, explain to a 10-year-old or a 15-year-old in more layman's terms, what happened with this outage as you kind of simplify it all out step by step.
a software update that was had a corrupt file basically interrupted your computers and your services that operate on that, rendering them useless.
And all of the computers that were affected, they had automatic updates happening?
I can't speak to the way the automation works, but I can speak to the way the rapid response Falcon sensor is intended to work. And that is intended to receive these file updates in real time to prevent real exploitation and abnormal behavior. And so this did circumvent what we would call a Patch Tuesday, where organizations receive and have the ability to manage the deployment of their patches on a specific day, which is usually Tuesday, right? That's what the famous Microsoft Patch Tuesday, so that it gives teams time during the week to work through any issues that may arrive from outages. Look, outages happen all the time.
Right, but not to 8 million computers at once.
On a global scale, no. This was a huge economic fail.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Okay, I saw this this visualization where you had all these different kind of these Jenga blocks, and then you had this one tiny one that was holding up everything. How do you answer the question, Cherise, as an industry person, industry expert, industry savant, right? Somebody who's been in the game for a couple decades. How do you answer the question of why? Why could it, or how could this happen to so many companies all at once? How do you answer that?
I would say a couple of ways. Primarily is through their market saturation of CrowdStrike having over 30,000 clients, the majority of them being major Fortune 500 companies. And so from a scale perspective, you mentioned, yes, 8.5 million endpoints were impacted that were receiving these updates. Now, time zone obviously had a lot to do with how long certain organizations were impacted. So for example, when I woke up in the morning, I've heard the news, just like every other organization waking up on this side of the continent, versus those that were actually dealing with the outage 6-8 hours while I was sleeping. The status and the reach that the CrowdStrikes, the McAfee antivirus, other organizations, it comes down to marketing dollars and spend and where they want to put trust into the organization and adopt their solution. Now, I think the real question you're asking is, there's been chatter about, well, and this is in a post-mortem reflection, is, was there too much reliance on a single solution across my entire infrastructure that touched it? And now we're seeing an unfortunate rippling of consequence of when it shut down. And could this have been prevented if I had a backup solution or an alternative solution? Well, I'm going to tell you right now, in this day and age, with reduced budgets for executives and business units, especially a non-ROI revenue generating P&L like IT, like where cybersecurity falls.
You try to save as much money as you can.
You barely have enough money to protect your assets, and you think you're buying a silver bullet, and I'm going to put the best antivirus with the newest AI so that I don't have to think about it, and I don't have to hire hundreds of engineers to test the product, to monitor the product, to analyze the actual behavior of these updates. It's an unfortunate reality that we live, and our executives are having to fight through the justifications of budgets and resources to try to anticipate an outage like this happening from a bad actor.
It's kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't, right? So if you do,
we would be having a different conversation if this was a bad actor.
Yeah. Okay. So covering a lot of ground here. I want to switch to this slide that you made, and I want to throw it on. CrowdStrike response. I mean, I remember
you're going to the funny part. We have to talk more
I
about
remember talking to you and talking to members of the industry early that morning, like 7 a.m., whatever, I think it was Saturday or Sunday morning. And I remember looking at online where the CEO of CrowdStrike said this was not a cyber attack, right? You just mentioned something, which was we would be talking a lot differently about this if this was a nation state actor. What's the real difference, right? You know, your house gets flooded, whether you leave the water on intentionally or it rains outside for too long. The same, you still have to replace all the carpet. You still have to replace all the sheetrock. What's your say on the why?
on the way that we've responded to this and how we've internalized this and our perspective on this, because it's from a friendly vendor, I think is pretty skewed. And let me tell you why. The impact that this had, whether it was intentional or not, was still unprecedented that this outage happened. And let me give you some numbers, right? You mentioned 8.5 million impacted endpoints. Let me give you some other numbers. The outage right now is being reported with over a $5.4 billion in direct loss.
How much?
5.4 billion. To put that in perspective, when we had the SolarWinds hack, which was a true malicious actor,
Right.
the total cost, I think numbers came out to, was right about $1 billion, and they had about 18,000 customer base.
Right.
CrowdStrike has over 30,000 customer base, and right now 5.4 billion in losses are being reported. The biggest industry to be hit is healthcare, with about a 1.9 billion. Banking is coming in right underneath that at 1.4 billion. Companies in the tech industry have lost about 43 million each that they're aggregating. But let's not get it twisted. The industries that were impacted on a global scale: transportation, logistics, oil and gas, healthcare, banking and finances. I mean, these are organizations and industries that affect everyday real people's lives. I'm talking surgeries were postponed that were supposed to be life-saving. We don't even know the impacts of those types of delays. People were not able to access their money in their bank accounts to pay for things that they needed that day or that week. People couldn't connect on a flight. Delta, $500 million right now is what they're claiming in losses. And there's a lawsuit, that's about.
So what was the card? What is that?
The what?
The thank you card.
So after all this impact, right, put that into perspective, CrowdStrike sent out Uber Eats thank you $10 cards to their partners and teammates that helped out during
That's not true.
This outage.
That's not true. That can't be true. That had to be already something that they were doing.
No. So, okay, if they sent it out to the teammates that helped and their partners that were helping, let me tell you why. Because this type of outage, you could not bring it back your system up in a globally managed.
You got to bring in your IT guy.
Individually rebooting each individual. And
so every computer that was affected had to be rebooted and reformatted with new operating system.
The drivers, yes, individually. You couldn't do this at scale in a management console system. And
so let's just talk about that from a, functionally how that, or operationally how that looks. So how many people were on your average quote IT team in your last 2 to 3 enterprises that you worked at before you became an entrepreneur? How many quote IT guys did you have on staff versus how many computers you think would be affected per enterprise? Just throw some numbers out.
I would say under 10 on the IT side at a large Fortune 100 organization supporting global assets, and on the OT side, sub 5. So,
and then how many systems do you think that they had to go deal with on, July 19th, 2021?
Thousands.
So just to put that into perspective, what you're saying is that the real complexity here, the real challenge or the real impact operationally was that a very few number of skilled workers were called upon to fix a huge amount of computer systems that went bad. And the reason that they, quote, went bad is because in an effort to scale, they chose to deploy the same type of software on the same type of operating system to make it easier, in theory, with regular updates. And now we went back to the Stone Ages where we're calling on a bunch or a few number of people to go manually fix all these. Do you think if you ran a chemical company, when did this happen? On July 19th?
Mm-hmm. On
All
a
right,
Friday.
July 29th, or right now, you're at your next board meeting. You run a medium-sized chemical company with 10 sites. You had to go to all those sites to fix this issue. Do you think there is an argument for switching out different operating systems, different computer systems, different antivirus software, different software used at each of the facilities in an effort to protect against this kind of all or nothing outage?
So I will say, when you're dealing with critical infrastructure, resiliency, backups, safety, and environmental is number one. And so when you're looking at mitigating your risks, you're always thinking about, if this shuts down, how can I go into manual mode? How can I prevent the spread of failure or that outage? And so as a leader of these critical sites, yes, I would be thinking about how can we prevent this from happening next time, because we will always continue to have an element of some kind of engineering workstation at those sites to help feed data in, make some business decisions, access email.
The computer systems aren't going anywhere. I'm just saying, would you run 3 of your systems on Windows, 3 of your systems on Mac? I'm not saying, forget how you can connect all of your critical infrastructure, engineering and automation. I'm just simply saying,
they have to go through.
Would you change the way you do this?
I would have to rethink the risk tolerance at those sites on whether or not any of the outages produced material risk to my operations, people, safety, and environment. And if the answer is yes, then I would have to ask a different series of questions around how can we mitigate this specific risk, just the way organizations do business impact analysis against certain types of scenarios of risk, whether it's how do I prevent ransomware? How do I prevent unplanned outage? How do I prevent supply chain vendor issues? This type of event, an unplanned outage, this is where that would fit. And then we'd have to look at the assets that it impacts. So for example, can I tolerate being in the blind? I'll give you an example. Back in the control centers of stream organizations that run pipelines,
right.
Yeah, well, they may not have engineering workstations, or they might having at the site. I guarantee you all that information is being tallied up into a control center offsite somewhere. Can those teams go blind for a period of time, not knowing the utilizations, the metrics, the sensor information, because the blue screen of death happened? I'll tell you, industry couldn't do it, and which is why they're going into a lawsuit. That's the airline industry with Delta. It impacted the tracking system. That tracking system created a blindness for the team, which then created hundreds of thousands of cancellations. So imagine that happening at the chemical sites or in a SCADA environment where you're now blind and you can't read your RTU metric levels because it's coming into a workstation that you received those visualizations on, because it had endpoint and it had CrowdStrike blue screen of death. So you asked me a question of if I would architect and design some mitigating controls differently. The answer is yes. Now, whether or not I can get budget approved to not have a single point of failure, because that's what we're talking about here, a single point of failure.
Right. It's interesting, and everybody's pointing their fingers. So I just wanted to give you, I've been doing a little bit of research. Delta stock as an example of one company that's taken a lawsuit action against CrowdStrike. Delta's down about 5%. Let me just go here. I'm going to look real quick. Delta last 6 months is down 4%. Microsoft is only down 0.83%, virtually nothing in the past 6 months. CrowdStrike is down 24% in the last 6 months. It's down 40% in the last 30 days. So let's talk real quick, as we think about what leg does a purchaser or customer of CrowdStrike have right now, theoretically, against CrowdStrike in a lawsuit?
I think it's going to come down to a couple of things. One, their insurance coverage, and I'll put that on the shelf for a second. Number two, if they can demonstrate and show a loss of revenue or a loss of X and tie it back to this particular outage, and wherein lies the responsibility for whatever MSA they have signed. So it goes back to T's and C's of their SLAs and their MSA. And in most software contracts, there is a threshold for which outages can occur, timelines, and or the impacts of disruption. And if any of those timelines are exceeded, they may become now breach of that contract, and for which organizations in their rightful manner can try to recoup some of those costs, whether through insurance or through direct lawsuit. And if there was any kind of negligence in any of the way of this was handled, could have cause. Now, for the large organizations that have legal teams and this is what they do, great. But what about all those small organizations? What about the emergency system organizations in Alaska that were down and no one could make 911 calls? What about the hospitals that went down?
Well,
what about
everybody? So the problem is you can't. So just talking on the insurance play, if it was a ransomware attack, would be very different because that's usually listed out in a lot of situations. I think that the cyber insurance market in general needs retweaking. It's very challenging. Why would this not be considered cyber? But I guarantee you, a lot of companies can't claim it
because maybe it wasn't a true cyber attack.
Yeah.
So
there's both sides to the argument. I think that if everybody was able to capitalize on some sort of loss, I think it would flip the insurance industry on its head, which is already at risk of not having enough.
We're also talking about going up against $1 billion IPO'd organization. In my opinion, it's one of those too big to fail scenarios. And I think
a lot of that in cybersecurity, I think.
I think that could be another episode for discussion. But yes, I think what we are going to see at the end of the day, the big organizations are going to weather this outage, recoup the loss in some manner. But for the smaller organizations that their business is run off of those computers, the payment systems, they lost revenue that day, which will never be recouped. And that can be very impactful for the small, medium businesses out there that had this.
Well, I want to bring up a point that I think if we think in quarters and years, something that I found very interesting about something you said earlier. Let's talk about secure development lifecycle. Just in layman's terms, you're in the software game, right? You have multiple layers, multiple people, multiple components of a sprint methodology to make sure that your code has been developed effectively and securely. What is secure development lifecycle to the average human being out there?
It's a series of steps, checks and balances and validation throughout the development of your code as it's being developed, as it's being tested, as it's being prepped for production, as it goes live.
And is there public knowledge right now about CrowdStrike that something didn't happen, or is it still under investigation?
So there's several sides to this point. As evident in the first slide, it does show that tests were done in a sequenced order on said files, but it's still a malform circumvented the type of testing that was done. So there's a lot of light that needs to be on the type.
So here's what I'm getting at. I'm kind of positioning this conversation towards one very bold statement, which is the NIS2 standard calls out secure development lifecycle in a way that I have not seen before in a standard or a framework that has some real teeth behind it. So If you've listened to a couple episodes prior, it's actually pretty funny. We did an NIS2 session on business of cyber twice right before this happened. I'm going to read you out of the NIS2 directive. Okay, it's about 100 pages. Member states shall ensure that when considering which measures referred to in paragraph 0.2 above, which is basically the 10 requirements that NIS2 says you have to get done to be compliant. Entities shall take into the account of the vulnerabilities specific to each direct supplier and service provider and the overall quality of products and cybersecurity practices of their suppliers and service providers, including their secure development procedures. Member states shall also ensure that when considering these measures, that they've taken into the account the results of the coordinated security risk assessments of critical supply chains. In layman's terms, the European Union is now going to require, with a heavy stick that they can enforce financially, that these organizations are required to ensure that their critical suppliers are following some sort of secure development lifecycle. My question to you is, does this count for something like CrowdStrike, where everybody like a Delta is now required to go to Microsoft, to go to, I mean, how do you enforce this, Cherise?
So there's a couple way around the assessment of risk around secure development life cycles. In addition to the NIS2, which takes a derivative of the 62443-4-1, which is a methodology and process for secure development lifecycle, which is a golden standard across the globe. When it comes to vendor due diligence, there's other standards, because when it comes, in the end of the day, CrowdStrike is a vendor of companies.
Right.
It can be seen also as a third party supplier due diligence check. So your question was, how and what people should be doing around that. I mean, when it comes to best practices, especially in vendor software, secure development lifecycle is an absolute must. We see this with organizations of large OEMs that take this very seriously, mostly because their parts and widgets are in critical infrastructure manufacturing and have to be sound and with their checks and balances. But when it comes to, let's just say CrowdStrike did follow their SDL and proves that they did have testing, the application of where those sensors and the elevated privilege is something that the SDL check would not find. A vendor due diligence of understanding the risk and dependencies of the said vendor and software would have. Should a technical knowledgeable engineer understand how that software executes at the kernel level and that it circumvents signatures, a control that prevents outages and blue screens. So it's a combination of both on the vendor due diligence side and making sure that your software vendors are practicing SDLC processes and methodologies.
It's interesting. When I was an auditor in the oil and gas industry, we would have to go and audit and essentially take a look at the secure development lifecycle of products being built, but we would actually go and on our own dime, go send in auditors at every step of the secure development lifecycle process for a product that we were paying tons of money for. And at some point during the process, you have to ask yourself, I'm paying for that vendor to provide a good product, yet I'm spending all this money on my own to go and audit and double check. And it's like, who really owns the responsibility of validating secure development lifecycle? Now,
well,
for
and
products,
the dependencies.
well, for products, there's certifications, and we could have a whole BOC on where that certification process lies. But it's a lot harder when you start deploying out software updates. And I think that the industry is, once again, in a situation like this, we see how vulnerable we all are. And at the end of the day, go hug an IT guy, because that's who's really solving this problem, or who solved this one.
Well, and also too, I think some of the lessons learned, I think this would be a really good opportunity to talk about, how organizations might start thinking about software that's deployed and the impacts, especially if there's any IT related software
Right.
or processes or systems that commingle in critical operations or critical
Yeah.
industries. Um, that is going to be a huge undertaking to try to anticipate the risks associated with any of these IT dependent softwares or devices in their network.
Right.
So that's one of the lessons learned that I didn't put up here. I think a lot of call to action during this time was around incident response plans, business continuity plans, disaster recovery for some, and it came in all forms. And I was reading a few articles on kind of some surveys that were done amongst CIOs and their organizations that were impacted, and these were pretty much the top lessons learned from multiple surveys. Everybody was in a panic the day of July 19th. I know I was elevated. And so I could only imagine being in the shoes of those CISOs or those engineering operations managers and trying to figure out how they can resume normal, safe operations in a manual backup manner in critical infrastructure.
Right.
So staying calm and not panicking was probably like step one, because when you're in a panic state, you can't make, it's difficult to make cohesive decisions and think through the cascading impacts on how to come back from this outage at scale. Again,
sense.
you got to remember when I say stay calm, like people were about to go into surgery, having life-altering medical procedures, and that just got
Right.
halted.
Yeah.
People were in surgery when blue screens came up. People
Yeah.
were on a plane when their tracking systems could not come back up and they're sitting there for hours on the tarmac or couldn't get access to a plane. Offshore rigs that were depending on those visualizations to make business decisions and communicate back on metrics, they didn't have that information. So
Makes sense.
So the staying calm part was a huge lessons learned for the leaders on how they handled those next 24 hours.
Yeah, it makes sense. So finish us off with some, you spoke about empathy, right? You came from the IT side. You've been in those shoes of being an IT person when the leader comes in and says, hey, we've got to go and do X. We got to go manually update everything. You've been in the budget holder meetings where people are considering, how do we ever prevent this from happening again? Give us a couple points about where you think the critical sector industry is now, and how does that color top 3 things that security leaders should be thinking about right now? If you had to boil it down to 3 things that if you were a CISO, you'd be thinking about, what would that be right now, Cherise?
I would be thinking about when this happens again, because this won't be the last time. Because we were on the world stage with all of our malicious actors now realizing how they can impact a global shutdown with one malformed packet. They just got to go get a job at a
one vendor. This isn't the first time this happened. It happened to a payment processing company. It happened to a data cloud company. There's a couple others where you get a body of companies all in a niche industry that use one vendor for the same thing. I hear you there. So it's not going to stop happening.
So it's not going to stop happening. So if I have that mindset, I have to figure out, how can I become resilient? Where are my critical single points of failure? And is it realistic to minimize those single points of failure in my critical revenue generating, safety, environmentally high risk portions of my business?
Okay. So number 1, you take a deep breath and you're saying, recognize that this is an example of a bad scenario, could have been worse. And how do we make sure that we have a mentality that it could happen again? That's number 1. Number 2, you're saying, go and evaluate all your different revenue generating or supporting facilities and figure out, do I have any single point of failures? You'd think that's already been done, but now it just gives it a little bit more importance, right? What's the last thing that you would
On the single point
do?
failure, when it comes to resiliency, you think of critical spares, you think of failovers. Like if you're thinking of your network and keeping up availability, because at the triangle for critical infrastructure, it's availability, right? Not confidentiality, not integrity. And so there's already a lot of mechanisms in place to prevent a single point of failure for communications, but no one suspected that the IT components or a engineering workstation component on different areas of your network that maybe not be deemed a high security level or impact could have residual impacts to the capability of making business decisions when that information is impeded. So looking at the applications, looking at the systems that help organizations make business decisions on a daily basis,
Right.
what are some of the risks around should those things not be operable? So really it's coming down to understanding that, and then understanding your vendors and what role they play in their fiduciary responsibility of the impacts. And that comes down to vendor due diligence at a technical, interdependent analysis. And then in terms of trying to figure out, how am I going to communicate and tie these risks, these potential impacts to my business outcomes that we work every day to achieve?
Right.
Safer, healthier environmental productions and revenue generation, right?
Makes sense. Well, I appreciate the time you came on the show. We are at time. Ladies and gentlemen, you've been watching the Business Cyber Show. You've been listening to Cherise Esparza wax poetic on the challenges with choosing one vendor. No, look, this is a big topic, and I know that you were passionate about this when it happened. Any final words for the audience?
I probably could not sum it up in a final word. To be continued.
Sounds good. Stay at it. I think the thing that I would tell people is that things happen in business for reasons we don't understand, and it brings to light how important every person is on the team. There's, the IT people saved the day, and now whether or not this is classified as an incident or an event, whether it was preventable or not, I do think that this is a net positive for the security industry. And the reason is that non-technical stakeholders are not really going to be drawing a line between, is that cybersecurity or is that IT or is that OT? They're going to say a system that was computerized or digitized went down, and either my safety had implications or my business went down, and we don't want that to happen. What I do think this is going to happen is it's bridging the gap between IT, OT. It's bridging the gap between operations and computer systems. And that is a healthy step in the right direction for critical sectors. And these events, whether we wanted them to or not, are pulling us together even more. So I think we have to use this for good. Ladies and gentlemen, that is the end of our show. Thanks so much for joining. Check us out next week. Cheers.
Thanks for having me.